What up? What up? What up? So we definitely got another book review. The book is really good by Charisse Burden-Stelly, also known as Dr. CBS. Really good book, Black Scare, Red Scare. If you really want to understand U.S. history, I strongly recommend this book. Pretty much, this book talks about the Red Scare, and it pretty much shows you that it was way more expansive than just Joseph McCarthy. So most people think Red Scare, they think about just the 40s and the 50s. They think about Joseph McCarthy, and she takes you on a long history of the U.S. essentially repressing and suppressing radical thought. Okay, so communist thought. So any individual or organization that essentially challenged white supremacy, militarism, economic exploitation and capitalism. Any of those things were being challenged. You were disciplined in similar ways, whether you were a communist or not, right? So you had people like A. Philip Randolph, who in the early 1900s just wrote about, wrote about being anti-lynching, being against lynchings, right? Where white folk was just able to kill black people on accusations of rape or any crime. And he, along with many other blacks, said, hey, black folks should be able to defend themselves. They shouldn't just allow themselves to just willingly be lynched, right? So they should arm themselves. They should practice self-defense. So for echoing those type of sentiments, you were looked at as being a radical and a subversive and a threat to the state, right? Even certain white folk, like I said, Eugene Debs, so people who was fighting for an 8-hour workday instead of a 13, 14-hour workday were looked at as being threats. Yeah, and then you had communists too, who were seen as threats just for their ideas, So in a country that you supposedly have freedom of speech, this book lets you know that freedom of speech was always a privilege. It was always a privilege. It was never a right. It was, you had freedom of speech as long as you didn't spread ideas that challenged U.S. Imperialism, capitalism, racism. As long as you didn't challenge any of those things, then you had freedom of speech, right? And then what is really interesting in the book, she kind of walks you through all of these committees that were set up in the U.S. To combat the threat of communism, and communism was the threat. It was similarly how the way they talked about communism was how many of us, how the U.S. state talks about Islamic terrorism and extremism, and it was looked at as like that type of threat, right? So they had all of these committees in the 1900s. So the Lust Committee, and these was at the local, state, and national level. So you had the Lust Committee, you had the Fish Committee, you had the Dyes Committee. So just look up those committees, right? And especially some of those committees in the 1900s, 1930s, 1938, and you had lynchings going on. You had the NAACP talking about how black folk were being lynched and just killed by white citizens who felt like they raped this person or stole this thing based on false accusations, being killed in gruesome ways. So instead of the U.S. state using its resources to fight against the Klan and racists and people who were lynching black folk, they used their resources to go after communists, right? They used all their resources to discipline and arrest and harass and surveil communists and people, like you said, and everybody got swept as being communists, right? So whether they were or not. So like I said, people like Marcus Garvey was looked at as a threat, right? Because of his views on black self-determination. And A. Philip Randolph, like I said, wasn't a communist. He was socialist, but he was just challenging white supremacy, and he was looked at as being a threat. Claudia Jones, she was a communist, right? But when you see some of the issues that she was fighting against lynchings, right? She was one of the people who was in support of defending the Scottsboro boys, who was pretty much falsely accused. It was like 9 boys in Alabama who were accused of raping and killing white women, and end up being false, right? So when you just look at that history, man, it's It's real interesting, man, because you see a lot of the same tactics by the U.S. state today. And like I said, she makes it really clear in the history. This is both Republicans and Democrats, right? You see anti-communism not only at the legislative branch, you see it in a lot of Supreme Court cases, and she walks you through all that history. You see it at the local level, the state level, the national level. You see it in executive orders, where at colleges and even to work for the government, you have to sign loyalty oaths saying that you're not a communist, that you don't associate with communists, that you're not sympathetic to communists. So it is, man, that book, it kind of reminds me a lot of what we see today when they try to say this person is woke or that person is woke. And they just, anything, like I said, anything that was challenging white supremacy or economic exploitation or militarism, like you just being anti-war, right? Like W.E.B. Du Bois in the 50s. He was facing a case because he just said that, hey, we don't want the U.S. involved with at war with Korea, right? We think that's wrong. He was looked at as being a threat, a communist. His passport was taken away. So this book corrects a lot of the myths that people have about U.S. history, and it'll give you a better view of our time today, right? So really get that book. It's real good.